What happens when two global giants lock horns over a nuclear issue?
Iran has warned that it would have no alternative but to acquire a nuclear weapon if it is attacked by the United States or its allies.
The world is watching as one of the most dangerous standoffs in modern history unfolds. For years, the U.S. and Iran have been on a collision course over Tehran's nuclear ambitions.
Tonight, Iran's supreme leader issuing a new warning to the United States.
We now shift our attention to Iran's growing military capabilities.
Each move by both nations adding fuel to an already volatile situation. The stakes are higher than ever, especially with President Trump's provocative threats to bomb Iran's nuclear sites unless an agreement is reached. These aren't just words. They're a clear declaration that diplomacy is nearing its breaking point. But here's where the story gets even more complicated. Standing firmly between the U.S. and Iran is Russia, a key player with its geopolitical interests in the region. Moscow has been unwavering in its warning to the U.S. Military action against Iran's nuclear infrastructure would lead to catastrophic consequences. But as tensions rise, the world is left wondering, can Russia's calls for diplomacy hold the line? Or will we witness a dangerous escalation that risks pulling the entire region and the world into conflict? Let's find out. If they don't make a deal, there will be bombing. It will be bombing the likes of which they have never seen before. This stark declaration by President Donald Trump encapsulates the gravity of the U.S. stance on Iran's nuclear program. Trump's words are not mere rhetoric. They're a clear warning that the U.S. is prepared to escalate tensions to an unimaginable level if Iran does not comply with its demands. These threats come in the wake of the U.S.'s withdrawal from the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, a landmark agreement that had placed strict limits on Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief. The U.S.'s exit from the deal left a power vacuum, one that has been filled by escalating animosity and a lack of viable diplomatic avenues. The core of the U.S.'s argument lies in its belief that Iran's nuclear ambitions go beyond peaceful purposes. Tehran insists that its nuclear program is focused solely on energy production and medical applications. But for Washington, this is a hard sell. The fear is that Iran's nuclear infrastructure, particularly its uranium enrichment facilities, could eventually pave the way for the development of nuclear weapons. Trump, backed by a hardline faction of his administration, has made it clear that the U.S. is unwilling to let this happen, regardless of the costs. In an interview, Trump doubled down, stating that should Iran fail to reach an agreement, it would face severe consequences. But the question that looms larger than the threat itself is, what would those consequences entail? Trump's rhetoric is alarming for a reason. A military strike on Iran's nuclear sites would represent a massive escalation in the already volatile Middle East, triggering a chain reaction with ramifications far beyond the region's borders. For many, this kind of rhetoric isn't just a diplomatic tool. It's a direct challenge to Iran's sovereignty and its right to pursue nuclear energy. But for the U.S., it's about preserving the delicate balance of power in the region and ensuring that Iran does not gain a nuclear capability that could shift the entire geopolitical landscape. The consequences of a U.S. bombing campaign would be devastating, not just for Iran, but for its neighbors, global stability, and international order. But here comes someone to stand with Iran. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Africa's geopolitics, economy, and changing landscape. Let's continue now. Catastrophic consequences. These words, delivered by Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov, echo through the halls of global diplomacy as a stark warning to the U.S. Military action against Iran's nuclear infrastructure could unleash a wave of devastation that extends far beyond the borders of the Middle East. Unlike the U.S., which has continued its rhetoric of force, Russia has adopted a different approach, urging the U.S. to abandon the path of confrontation and embrace dialogue. Russia's position is rooted in its deep concerns about the broader implications of U.S. military action. According to Ryabkov, an attack on Iran's nuclear facilities would not only destabilize the region, but also set a dangerous precedent for international relations. The consequences, he argues, would not be limited to the immediate aftermath of a military strike. Rather, Such action would undermine the fragile balance of power in the Middle East and threaten global stability by escalating tensions with countries that are already wary of U.S. interventionism. At the heart of Russia's diplomatic response lies a belief in the power of dialogue and negotiation. Moscow has consistently called for a return to the negotiating table, urging both Washington and Tehran to seek a peaceful resolution to their differences. Unlike the U.S., Russia is keen to avoid any military escalation that could ignite a broader conflict, potentially involving global powers like China and Russia themselves. This is why Moscow has been vocal in its condemnation of Trump's threat to use force, stressing that diplomacy remains the only viable path forward. Russia's stance also comes from its growing strategic relationship with Iran. Over the years, the two nations have strengthened their political and economic ties, culminating in a strategic partnership agreement signed in January. For Russia, supporting Iran is not only a matter of diplomacy, but also an opportunity to enhance its influence in the region. By offering itself as a mediator, Russia seeks to position itself as a key player in resolving the crisis, underscoring its influence as a counterbalance to U.S. dominance in the Middle East. However, Russia's motivations are not purely altruistic. While Moscow advocates for peace, it also understands that a destabilized Middle East could have severe repercussions for its interests, including its energy policies and its broader geopolitical ambitions. Russia, in essence, is playing a careful game of balancing its support for Iran with the broader goal of preventing a conflict that could spiral out of control. In this delicate diplomatic game, the U.S. and Iran are locked in a standoff, but Russia remains intent on keeping the door open for negotiations, even as the risk of war looms large. Now the question is, can Russia play the role of a peacekeeper in this volatile situation, or is its involvement simply a strategic maneuver to assert its influence? Unlike the U.S., which has largely relied on threats and economic pressure, Russia has consistently called for a return to dialogue, advocating for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. But can Russia be trusted to act as an impartial broker, or does its geopolitical agenda complicate the situation? At the heart of Russia's involvement is its growing strategic partnership with Iran, which has blossomed in recent years. In January, Moscow and Tehran signed a major strategic partnership agreement that deepened their political, military, and economic ties. This partnership has provided Russia with a significant foothold in the region, strengthening its influence at a time when the U.S. has been retreating from the Middle East. But while Russia's ties to Iran are clear, it's important to recognize that Moscow's push for diplomacy is driven by more than just a desire to support its ally. It's also about securing its interests and avoiding the destabilization of the region. Russia has been keen to maintain its standing as a global power capable of influencing key international issues. Its support for Iran serves to challenge U.S. dominance in the Middle East and balance the growing influence of other global powers, like China. However, this doesn't mean that Russia is eager to see a military confrontation between the U.S. and Iran. A full-blown conflict would not only undermine Russia's political and economic interests, but could also draw Moscow into a broader confrontation with the U.S. and its allies. The Kremlin, therefore, has a vested interest in preventing war. Despite these motives, Russia's calls for diplomacy have been largely consistent and have focused on the need for a negotiated solution. Russian diplomats have repeatedly urged both the U.S. and Iran to return to the negotiating table, suggesting that Moscow is well positioned to facilitate such talks. With its unique relationship with both countries, Russia has the diplomatic leverage to offer itself as a neutral third party capable of bridging the gap between Washington and Tehran. But this is not just about Russia playing the role of an unbiased mediator. It is also about Moscow positioning itself as a key player in global diplomacy. By offering to facilitate peace talks, Russia is asserting its influence on the world stage, reminding both the U.S. and Iran that it is a force to be reckoned with in shaping the future of the Middle East. Yet, even as it promotes diplomacy, Russia's actions should be viewed through the lens of its strategic interests. But what happens when the U.S. and Iran's tensions escalate beyond the Middle East? The potential for a military confrontation between the U.S. and Iran has implications that extend far beyond the Middle East. While the focus has largely been on regional stability, the global ramifications of such a conflict would be profound, affecting everything from energy markets to international alliances and potentially reshaping global geopolitical dynamics. One of the most immediate and pressing concerns would be the impact on global oil markets. Iran, a major player in the oil industry, controls one of the world's largest reserves of crude oil. Any disruption to its oil exports, whether through military action or retaliatory strikes, would send shockwaves through global energy markets. Oil prices would likely surge, reaching levels that could have destabilizing effects on economies worldwide, especially in oil-dependent nations. Countries like China, India, and parts of Europe, which rely on Iranian oil, would face major economic challenges, potentially driving inflation and slowing economic growth. This economic turbulence would ripple out across the globe, affecting everything from fuel prices to the cost of goods and services, further straining international relations. Beyond the economic fallout, the geopolitical landscape would be forever altered. U.S. allies in the Middle East, particularly Israel and Saudi Arabia, would find themselves in an even more precarious position. While both nations have long had tense relationships with Iran, an outright war would place them in the center of a conflict that could change the region's power dynamics. With Iran potentially launching retaliatory attacks, these countries would not only face security threats, but could also become targets of international backlash, further isolating them from the global community. In the broader international context, the conflict would likely lead to a realignment of global alliances. Russia, China, and even some European nations have expressed concerns about the U.S.'s aggressive stance toward Iran, and many are likely to weigh in on the side of diplomacy. Russia, already heavily invested in Iran both economically and strategically, could step up its support for Tehran, potentially providing military assistance or other resources. Similarly, China, which depends on Iranian oil and has deep economic ties with the region, would likely take a strong stance against U.S. military intervention. Such a realignment of global alliances could further complicate an already volatile situation, making international cooperation on other critical issues, such as climate change, trade, and security, more difficult. The cultural and social implications would also be significant. A military strike on Iran would inflame anti-American sentiments across the globe, especially in the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Asia. Protests, political unrest, and social movements could spread rapidly, further destabilizing already fragile nations. The perception of the U.S. as an aggressor in the eyes of the global public would fuel existing distrust, making future diplomatic efforts that much more difficult. In many parts of the world, the U.S. would be seen not as a peacekeeper but as an imperial power imposing its will on a sovereign nation. Perhaps the most terrifying consequence, however, would be the potential for the conflict to escalate into a wider war involving multiple global powers. With Russia, China, and other nations increasingly opposing U.S. policies, a confrontation could evolve into a proxy war, with competing alliances, military engagements, and indirect confrontations spread across multiple theaters. The risk of such a conflict spiraling out of control is higher than ever, and the stakes have never been greater. In the end, the question we must ask is not just what happens in the Middle East, but how this conflict reverberates around the world. Can global stability withstand the shockwaves of a U.S.-Iran confrontation? Or are we witnessing the early stages of a geopolitical shift that will change the balance of power for decades to come? Let us know in the comment section. Is the U.S. making a mistake? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: African politics, economy, and increasing power. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.